The morning Gilbert Norris rode into Calico Creek with nothing but a worn saddle, a bay horse named Copper, and a deed to the most run-down piece of land in the county. Eliza Hart was already 3 hours into her day, and had not yet decided whether the world owed her anything at all. She was 26 years old, which was old enough to have buried a husband and young enough to still feel the particular ache of loneliness that comes not from solitude itself, but from the memory of company. She had been running the Hart homestead alone for 2 years, ever since Thomas Hart had gone out one January morning to check the fence line, and had not come back until the spring thaw revealed him in the gully at the eastern edge of the property, where his horse must have thrown him in the dark. The doctor said it was fast. Eliza had held on to that like a coin in a clenched fist. The land was 80 acres of red dirt Texas soil, roughly a day's ride southeast of Abilene in the year 1872, a time when the cattle drives were beginning to reshape the whole character of the territory. The grass was good when it rained, which was not always, and the creek that bisected the property gave her water enough for her small vegetable garden, her 2 milk cows, Bess and Harriet, and the dozen chickens that had survived the previous winter's coyote trouble. She grew what she could, sold eggs and surplus vegetables to the general store in Calico Creek proper, and she managed. That was the word for it. She managed. The abandoned homestead to her north had belonged to the Cooley family before the drought of 1870 drove them east toward greener prospects. It was a squat little house with a collapsed front porch, a barn that leaned so dramatically to one side it seemed to be listening to something underground, and a windmill that had not turned in 2 years. Eliza had gotten accustomed to looking at that property the way you get accustomed to a missing tooth, aware of the absence, having long since made your peace with the gap. So when she saw the dust rising from that direction on the morning of the 14th of April, she stood at her kitchen window with a coffee cup halfway to her lips and simply stared. A rider. Coming from the direction of town, following the rutted wagon track that led past her gate and continuing north toward the Cooley place. The horse was a handsome bay, well kept despite the dust of the trail. The man in the saddle sat straight, which told her something, because men who had ridden long distances either sat very straight or sagged in the way of old sacks of grain, and the ones who sat straight were either military or stubborn, and in her experience those two things were often the same. She set her coffee down and watched. He did not stop at her gate. He did not even look toward her house, or if he did, she could not tell at this distance. He continued north and disappeared behind the ridge of scrub oak that separated her property from the Cooley land, and Eliza stood at her window for a long moment after the dust settled, feeling something she could not quite name. Suspicion, perhaps, or something adjacent to it. She went back to her morning work and told herself it was probably nothing. Probably just some passing rider taking a shortcut. Probably nothing at all. But by afternoon, she could hear the sound of hammering. Eliza Hart went to bed that night with the bedroom window open, as she always did when the spring air was mild, and lay on her back listening to the darkness with a peculiar alertness she had not felt in some time. The hammering had continued until well past dusk. Someone was making themselves at home on the Cooley property, and she had not been asked, which was not legally required, but which still seemed to her the kind of courtesy a person ought to extend to a neighbor. She did not sleep well after that. The next morning she rose before first light, fed the chickens, milked Bess, and then did what she had been telling herself she was not going to do, which was saddle up her gray mare, Juniper, and ride north to the Cooley place to have a look. The property looked different already, and it had only been a day. Someone had propped up the porch posts with fresh-cut timber. The barn door that had been hanging by a single hinge was secured. A fire ring had been cleared near the side of the house, and a small camp had been established with orderly precision bedroll, saddlebags, a Dutch oven, and a coffee pot that was, at this very moment, sitting over a low flame. The man was around the far side of the house when she arrived, so she heard him before she saw him. He was talking to his horse in the easy, conversational way that people who spend a great deal of time alone in the company of animals sometimes do, and the sound of it was so unexpectedly warm that she almost turned Juniper around right then. She did not. "Hello," she called, keeping her voice level and businesslike. "I am your neighbor, Eliza Hart. I own the property to your south." There was a pause, a brief silence between one hammer strike and the next, and then the man came around the corner of the house, and Eliza got her first proper look at Gilbert Norris. He was perhaps 30 years old, maybe a year or two older, with the kind of face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something that was less handsome in the conventional sense and more arresting in the way that landscapes are arresting. All angles and shadow, and an expression in the dark eyes that suggested he was paying close attention to whatever was in front of him. He was broad through the shoulders, lean through the middle, and he had sawdust on his hat and a stripe of fresh grease across the back of his left hand, where he had evidently been working on something mechanical. He looked at her with the same directness she had tried to project at him, and she was aware, suddenly and inconveniently, that she had not thought about what she looked like this morning. "Mrs. Hart," he said, which surprised her because she had not told him her title. He must have asked in town. "I was going to come introduce myself once I had the place in some kind of shape. I am Gilbert Norris. I apologize for the noise yesterday evening." "It carried," she said. "I imagine it did." He came forward to stand near her horse's head, which was the polite thing to do, so she did not have to speak down at him from the saddle. He did not reach for Juniper, which was also polite. He waited to see if the horse would come to him, and Juniper, who was shamefully undiscriminating about people, immediately lowered her head and pressed her nose against his shoulder. He raised a hand and rubbed her jaw, not looking at the horse, looking at Eliza. "You bought the place?" she asked. "I did. Registered the deed in town yesterday morning." He paused. "You look like you have questions." "I have one question," Eliza said. "What are your intentions with the land?" He considered this with a gravity she had not expected, as if it were a genuinely difficult question deserving of a genuinely careful answer. "I intend to run cattle," he said. "I came up from the Brazos country with a small herd, 12 head at the moment. I left them at the stockyard in town until I have the fencing repaired. I intend to expand in time. I'm not looking to buy anyone out or create any disputes about water rights. I have no quarrel with anyone." She studied him. "Where are you from, Mr. Norris?" "Originally, Missouri, but I have been moving generally southwest for about 7 years. I spent 3 years working cattle drives between San Antonio and Abilene, and I have been saving toward land for most of that time." He said it without pride or apology, just as information. "I know the territory reasonably well. I know that the creek on this property feeds from the same source as the one on yours, and I want you to know that I have no intention of interfering with your water access." She had not expected him to volunteer that, and it disarmed her more than she would have liked. "All right," she said. "I am glad to hear it. Can I offer you coffee?" She should have said no. She had work to do, and she was not here to be sociable. She was here to take the measure of this man and determine whether he was going to be a problem. But the coffee pot was right there over its little fire, and the morning was still cool, and she said, "1 cup." She tied Juniper to the fence post and followed him to the fire ring, and she stood with both hands wrapped around a tin mug that had seen better decades, and watched him move around the small camp with the economy of motion that belonged to people who had lived close to the land for a long time. He poured his own cup and straightened and looked out across the northern pasture, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable, which she noted and filed away. "You were expecting someone to come bother you," he said, not looking at her. "I was expecting to need to make something clear," she agreed. "Have you?" She thought about it. "Mostly," she said. The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile but not quite, and she drank her coffee and looked at the broken windmill and the leaning barn and the general state of comprehensive neglect that was the Cooley property, and she thought about what it would take to make something of this land again. "You have a lot of work ahead of you," she said. "I know it." The windmill will need a new pump rod and at least 2 new fan blades. There is a man in town, a blacksmith named Overton, who does that kind of metal work. He is fair." Gilbert Norris looked at her then, and there was something in his expression that was not quite surprise but was close to it, as if he had not expected useful information, as if he had expected only the cold civility of a neighbor who wanted to be left alone. "Thank you," he said. She handed back the tin cup and untied Juniper. "I expect there will be an adjustment period," she said, which was the most diplomatic thing she could think of to say. "I expect so," he agreed. "I hope it is a short one." She rode home and milked Harriet, who was overdue and reproachful about it, and she told herself she felt better having met the man and knowing what she was dealing with, which was true. What was also true, and which she did not tell herself, was that she lay awake again that night with the window open, listening to the dark, and that this time the sleeplessness had a different quality to it. Less like weariness and more like the feeling you get when something important has shifted, and you have not yet worked out whether it has shifted in a direction you wanted. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm. She heard him working from dawn until dusk most days, and she grew accustomed to the sounds: the hammer, the saw, the occasional instruction called to his horse, the creak of the windmill as he began to repair it piece by piece. On the third morning she found a cloth sack hanging from her fence post, and inside it were 4 large brown eggs. She stared at the eggs for a long moment. She went inside and came back out with a jar of plum preserves and hung it on the same fence post, which was as much of a statement as she intended to make, and she went back to work. On the 5th day, she was replacing a fence board along her northern boundary when he appeared on the other side, also working on his fence, and they worked in parallel for nearly an hour without speaking, except to acknowledge the obvious necessity of coordinating where the boundary line fell, which they established without dispute, and with the help of the original survey marker, a chunk of limestone with a carved X that had been there since the property was first platted in 1864. "Your husband filed this claim?" he asked, not looking up from his work. "He did, in '68. He came out from Tennessee." She paused. "He died 2 winters ago. I am sorry." "Yes." She drove a nail with more force than necessary. "Most people are." He did not say anything else about it, which she appreciated, because there were really only 2 things people said about Thomas when they found out he was gone, and she had heard both of them so many times that they had worn smooth and lost all meaning, like river stones. That evening, as she was bringing the cows in, she saw him standing at his windmill with his arms crossed, looking up at the tower with an expression of focused dissatisfaction. The windmill was nearly fixed, but there was one component he clearly could not get right, and she could see from 40 yards away that the fan assembly was slightly off-center. She should have kept walking. "The top bracket," she called. "It is torqued to the left. You will need to loosen the 2 bolts on the right side and shift it before you tighten them back." He looked over at her, then back up at the windmill. Then he climbed the tower with the easy confidence of a man who did not give much thought to heights, adjusted what she had indicated, and climbed back down. The windmill turned. It turned in the light evening wind, and the pump engaged, and water came up through the pipe and into the trough he had built below it, and he stood there with his hands in his back pockets watching it with an expression of such unguarded pleasure that Eliza felt something shift in her chest, something she immediately put back in its place with the firm efficiency of a woman who had learned not to let things shift without her permission. "Thank you," he said. "You are welcome," she said, and took her cows inside. Over the following weeks, something began between them that neither of them named, because naming it would have required acknowledging it, and they were both, for different reasons, cautious people. It was made of small things: a sack of eggs left on a fence post, a jar of preserves in return, a shared 20 minutes on opposite sides of a fence discussing the creek water levels after a dry spell, a moment when she brought a complaint to him about the noise his cattle were making at 3 in the morning, and he looked at her across his threshold with something that was not quite amusement but was warm in the same way, and said that he was sorry and that he would speak to the cattle about it. And she had laughed despite herself. A real laugh, sharp and sudden, like something she had not expected to find in her own body. She had not laughed like that in a long time. She thought about that on the way home and decided not to think about it again. The town of Calico Creek was the kind of place that noticed things, because in a settlement of roughly 240 people, there was not enough happening that you could afford to ignore any of it. The general store was run by a woman named Ada Pruitt, who was somewhere north of 50 and had the memory of an elephant and the discretion of a courthouse notice board. Eliza went into town every Thursday for supplies, and on the Thursday that fell 3 weeks after Gilbert Norris's arrival, Ada Pruitt said, while measuring out a length of calico, "I see you have a new neighbor." "I do," Eliza said. "Gilbert Norris. He was in here Monday last. Bought a considerable amount of provisions." Ada paused in her measuring. "He asked after you, nothing forward about it. He just asked whether you were well regarded in town, and I said you were. He seemed satisfied." Eliza considered this information. "Did he?" "He did. He seems a steady sort. He paid his bill in full and in coin, which is more than I can say for some." Ada handed over the calico. "He is not married as far as anyone in town can establish." "Ada," Eliza said, "I am simply providing information. You are providing editorial comment dressed as information." Ada smiled, which crinkled her entire face into something warm and unreserved. "Perhaps. But you have been alone a long time, Eliza, and you are young, and it is not sinful to notice that a decent man has come to live next door." Eliza paid for her goods and left, which was not exactly a gracious exit but was the most honest one available to her at the moment, because Ada was not wrong and she knew it, and that was precisely the problem. The spring in Calico Creek that year was beautiful in the way that West Texas springs sometimes are sudden and generous, the land going from brown to green in what felt like a matter of days, the creek running clear and cold from the hill country to the northwest. Eliza's garden came in better than it had in 2 years, the tomatoes and squash and beans filling in the rows with the kind of enthusiasm that made up for all the seasons they had not done so. She was in the garden on a Saturday morning in late May when she heard Juniper making a sound in the paddock that indicated alarm, and she came around the side of the house with a trowel in her hand and found Gilbert Norris at her gate, which was the proper place to stop and wait, and he had stopped and was waiting. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said. "I have a situation I think requires a second opinion, and you are the most sensible person I have encountered in this county." This was either a compliment or a very low assessment of Calico Creek's population, and she suspected both. She came to the gate. He had a leather-wrapped bundle under one arm, and she searched for the word uncertain. She had not seen him look uncertain before. It made him look younger. "What kind of situation?" she asked. "I found something in the house this morning, in the wall behind the chimney where some of the plaster had come away." He held out the bundle, and she took it and unwrapped it and found a tin box, and inside the tin box was a collection of papers and 2 small photographs and a child's shoe, very small, made of soft leather. She looked up at him. "The Cooley family," he said. "I think. There is a name on some of the papers. I do not want to throw it away, but I do not know what to do with it. I thought perhaps you knew them, or knew where they went." She stood at her gate holding the tin box and looking down at the child's shoe, which was the most heartbreaking thing she had encountered in some time, and felt an unexpected wave of respect for this man who had found this buried piece of another family's story and had not simply discarded it. "Come in," she said, opening the gate. "I will make coffee." He sat at her kitchen table, which felt enormous and strange, having a person at it again. She had not had a guest in the house since the pastor had come to call after Thomas died, and that had been a different kind of sitting at the table. She was aware of the sunlight on the table and his hands around the cup and the slight discomfort they both felt, which was not the bad kind of discomfort but the kind that comes from proximity to something unfamiliar. She looked through the papers. "Clara Cooley," she said, reading a name from a folded letter. I remember Mrs. Cooley. She came to church sometimes when they first arrived. She had a little girl, maybe 3 or 4 years old. I do not know her name. Can we get the papers to them? Do you know where they went? They went east. I heard Kansas City, but I cannot be sure. She refolded the letter carefully. I will ask Ada Pruitt. Ada knows everything that has ever been said within 20 miles of this town. If there is a forwarding address, Ada will have it. He nodded, wrapping his hands around the cup. Thank you, he said, for this, and for the windmill advice, and for the information about the blacksmith. She looked at him across the table. You do not need to keep a running tally, Mr. Norris. I am not keeping a tally, he said. I am noting that you have been generous to me and you did not have to be. She looked down at her coffee. You have not given me cause for complaint. That is a modest endorsement. It is the honest one. She paused. It is possible I was not immediately welcoming. The corner of his mouth moved. You were territorial, which is understandable. You have been keeping this land on your own and a stranger arrived. It would be strange not to be guarded. You were not offended. No, he said simply. I was relieved. A woman alone out here who lets every stranger walk right through her gate without question would not last long. It told me you had sense. She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. And they sat in her kitchen in the yellow morning light with the sound of the chickens outside and the smell of coffee between them. And it was the most comfortable she had felt in the company of another person in longer than she could clearly remember. He left after 1 cup, as he had come for a specific purpose and accomplished it, and she stood at her kitchen door and watched him ride north through the scrub oak, and she went inside and washed the cups and did not think about any of it for the rest of the day. Ada Pruitt, applied to on the following Thursday, produced a forwarding address for the Cooley family in Kansas City within approximately 4 minutes of being asked, which either spoke to her extraordinary record-keeping or her extraordinary interest in other people's business, and Eliza suspected it was both. She wrote a careful letter, enclosed the papers and the photographs, and posted it, keeping only the tin box as something the Cooley family had likely not intended to leave behind. She told Gilbert, and he looked satisfied in the quiet way that he had, and that was that. June arrived, and with it the heat, and the cattle drives that pushed through the territory became visible from the far ridgeline most afternoons, long ribbons of dust moving north toward Abilene. There was a particular wildness to the county in those months, the cattle towns filling up with drovers who were largely young and far from home, and inclined toward trouble after months on the trail. Calico Creek was small enough to avoid the worst of it, but not small enough to avoid all of it. On a Friday evening in the middle of June, Eliza was driving her wagon back from town when she came across a situation on the road that she had not anticipated, which was a group of 3 young men, obviously drovers by their trail-worn appearance, who had stopped their horses across the road in a way that was either an accident or an invitation to a conversation she did not want to have. She pulled up Juniper and set the brake and looked at them with the level expression she had spent 2 years perfecting. "You are in the road," she said. The oldest of the 3, who was perhaps 20 and had the kind of confidence that belongs to young men who have not yet encountered real consequences, grinned at her. "We are indeed, ma'am. Where are you headed?" "Home," she said, "as you will be once you move your horses." "Now there is no hurry." He moved his horse closer. "We have been on the trail since January and we are just being friendly." "Your friendly is in my way," she said. "Move." The second one laughed. She kept her eyes on the first one, because he was the one whose decision mattered, and she was reaching slowly and without drama toward the rifle she kept beneath the wagon seat, which Thomas had insisted she always carry, and which she had, in the 2 years since his death, never once fired at anything other than a coyote, but which she handled with a competence that was not performed. She never got to the rifle. From behind the drovers there came the sound of hoofbeats, measured and unhurried, and Gilbert Norris rode up the road from the south with the particular ease of a man who had nothing to prove, and therefore needed to prove nothing, and he came alongside Eliza's wagon and stopped there, and looked at the three young men with an expression that was utterly calm and absolutely final. "Evening," he said. The young man at the front of the group looked at him, made some rapid and accurate assessment, and his posture changed in a very specific way that Eliza had seen before. It was the change that happens when a person decides that whatever they thought they were doing is not actually worth doing. "Evening," the drover said. "We were just passing." "Then pass," Gilbert said pleasantly. They passed. Eliza watched them go until they were around the bend, and then she let out a slow breath and moved her hand away from the rifle and picked up her reins. "I was handling it," she said. "I know you were," he said. "I was not here to rescue you. I was here because I was coming back from town on the same road." She looked at him. He looked back, guileless, and she thought that was either the truth or the most considerate lie she had heard in some time. "Thank you anyway," she said, which was the first time she had said that to him, and it felt different from the way he said it to her, heavier or more weighted, or perhaps just more surprising coming from her own mouth. "You are welcome anyway," he said, and rode beside her wagon the rest of the way home, and they talked about the cattle drives and the price of beef and the general state of the roads, which were terrible, and it was the longest conversation they had had that was not about a fence line or a piece of property. When they reached the junction where his road split north from hers, he touched the brim of his hat and rode on, and she drove the rest of the way home in the warm blue dark of the summer evening, feeling something she had decided not to feel and feeling it anyway. July in Texas was not designed for comfort. It was designed for endurance. The thermometer that Thomas had nailed to the porch post regularly threatened 104 degrees, and the garden needed watering twice a day, and the cattle on both properties retreated to whatever shade they could find and stood there looking aggrieved in the particular way of cattle. On the 4th of July, the town of Calico Creek held its annual celebration, which consisted of a picnic on the green behind the church. A fiddle player named Mr. Beaumont, who was technically proficient if not inspired, a speech from the mayor that was considerably longer than the occasion required, and in the evening, a small fireworks display ordered from a supplier in Dallas that invariably contained one or two pieces that failed to fire and one or two that fired horizontally rather than vertically, which added to the general excitement. Eliza went. She went every year because Ada Prewitt organized the food, and Ada's organizational skill was such that not attending felt like a personal slight, and also because it was one of the few occasions when the entire community gathered in one place and you could take the measure of things. She wore her blue dress, which was her best, and she pinned her hair with the amber pins that had belonged to her mother, and she drove herself to town in the wagon and left Juniper's reins with the boy who minded horses for a nickel outside the church. Gilbert Norris was there. She had not known he would be, or she had not let herself think about whether he would be, which amounted to the same thing. He was standing near the lemonade table talking to the blacksmith Overton when she arrived, and he saw her across the green and nodded, and she nodded back, and she went to help Ada set out the food. "He cleans up well," Ada said, not looking up from the pie she was arranging. "Ada, I am merely observing. Your observations have a direction to them." "All observations do," Ada said serenely. "That is what makes them observations rather than simple looking." Over the course of the afternoon they moved closer together by degrees, the way things do when they are not being forced conversations with mutual acquaintances that happen to include both of them. A shared moment of amusement at the mayor's speech, a coincidence of reaching for the lemonade ladle at the same time and both drawing back, and then both laughing, and him saying, "After you," and her taking the ladle and pouring her glass. When Mr. Beaumont struck up his fiddle in the early evening, people began to dance on the packed earth, and Eliza stood watching with Ada at her side and did not think about dancing because she had not danced since before Thomas died, and it seemed like a door she was not ready to open. Then Gilbert Norris was beside her, and he said, "I dance very badly. I want to say that first so that when it becomes apparent you are not taken by surprise." She looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I was thinking of asking you to dance, and honesty seemed like the right beginning." She considered this for a moment that was long enough to feel significant. "I also dance badly," she said. "Then we are well matched," he said, and held out his hand. She took it. They were both being truthful. Neither of them was a natural dancer. But there was something in the shared awkwardness of it, in the fact that they were both trying and neither was judging, and they were both smiling at themselves and at each other, that made it feel like more than dancing. She was aware of his hand at her waist and her hand in his, and the summer heat and the fiddle and the fireflies that were just beginning to appear at the edges of the green, and she thought, "There it is. There is the thing I was not going to feel." The fireworks came, and they watched from the edge of the green, standing close but not touching, and when one of the fireworks went sideways and sailed into the old oak at the corner of the churchyard, with a spectacular shower of sparks that nearly caught the lower branches and set half the crowd screaming and the other half laughing, they both turned to look at each other at exactly the same moment, and she laughed again, and his face when she laughed was something she would carry for a long time. He drove her home. She had not asked him to. He had offered and she had said yes, which was becoming a pattern she was aware of and not yet ready to interrupt. They sat side by side on the wagon bench in the dark, with Juniper walking at a comfortable pace, and the July stars overhead in the improbable abundance they took on in the Texas dark. And he told her about Missouri, about his mother, who had died when he was 12, and his father, who had been a farmer and a difficult man, and the older brother who had gone to fight in the war and come back different in the way that many men who went to fight came back different, and the slow drift west that had followed. She told him about Tennessee, about her own father who had been a school teacher and had given her an education that was unusual for a girl in a small town in 1860, which she was grateful for every single day. She told him about meeting Thomas Hart at a church social and thinking he was the most straightforward, decent man she had ever encountered, which was true, and about following him west with all the faith of a person who had not yet learned what the West could take from you. "Do you regret coming?" he asked. Not about Thomas, about the West, about this particular life. She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "I am harder than I was and more capable. And I know myself in a way I do not think I would have if I had stayed in Tennessee and married a school teacher and had a comfortable life." She paused. "I also miss comfortable some days." "That seems like a reasonable thing to miss," he said. When they reached her gate, he helped her down from the wagon, which required her to take his hand and then briefly both his hands, and when she was standing on the ground they were closer together than was strictly necessary, and neither of them moved away immediately. "Thank you for the dancing," she said, "poor as it was." "Thank you for not abandoning me to the fiddle alone," he said. She went inside and stood in her dark kitchen and put her hands flat on the table and stood there for a long time, breathing. She slept well that night. That was the thing that undid her in retrospect. After all those weeks of lying awake with the window open and the feeling of something shifted in the dark, she went to bed on the 4th of July and slept deeply and completely, as if something in her had resolved itself or been given permission. In the morning she was furious about it, briefly and productively, and then she picked up her trowel and went to the garden, and life continued. August was when the trouble came, because trouble in the West Texas of 1872 did not tend to respect summer holidays. It arrived in the form of a land claim dispute that had nothing to do with Gilbert or Eliza directly, but had everything to do with the county surveyor's office, which had apparently made an error in 1868 when Thomas Hart's claim was originally filed, and which was now being exploited by a cattle operation out of San Angelo called the Braddock Company, which had a particular interest in the water rights along the creek that bisected her property. She learned about this from the county assessor himself, a nervous little man named Pryor, who rode out on a Tuesday morning with a sheaf of papers and the expression of a man delivering bad news to someone he expected would not take it well, and he was right. The survey, Pryor said, standing at her gate and not quite meeting her eyes, shows an inconsistency in the original filing. The eastern boundary of the Hart claim, as recorded, does not correspond precisely with the survey markers on the ground. The Braddock Company has filed a petition asserting that the creek bed falls within the disputed area, and until the petition is resolved, the water rights are, technically, in question. Eliza looked at the papers for a long time. She had run this land alone for 2 years. She had kept it through a winter that would have broken most men she knew. She had repaired the roof and the well casing and the fence on the south boundary and the gate and the chicken coop and 100 other things, and she had done it alone, and she was not going to lose her water rights to a company out of San Angelo that had never set foot on this land. "What do I need to do?" she asked. "You will need to appear before the land office in Abilene to contest the petition," Pryor said, "within 30 days of this notification. You will want documentation, the original deed, any survey notes you have, any correspondence related to the filing." She had all of those things in the tin box in her bedroom, organized and preserved because she was not a woman who lost important papers. She thanked Pryor with a curtness that was the best she could manage and went inside and sat at her kitchen table and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of pure unguarded fear. The visceral terror of someone who knows exactly how close to the edge they are living and has just learned the edge is closer than they thought. And then she stood up and went to work. Gilbert appeared at her gate that evening. He must have seen Pryor's horse in the yard that morning because he said, "I heard there was a county man out here today," and his voice had a particular quality to it, careful and watchful, as if he was prepared for whatever she was about to tell him. She told him about the Braddock petition. He listened without interrupting, which was a quality she had come to appreciate about him, and when she was done he was quiet for a moment and then said, "The Braddock Company is not well regarded. I know a man in San Angelo who knows their operation, and they have done this before, identified water rights disputes in the official record and moved to exploit them before the original owner can respond. What happened to the previous owners? Some of them settled, some of them lost." He met her eyes. "You will not lose." It was said with a certainty that was not boastful, just cert, the way you say that the sun will come up, and it moved through her like something warm. "I cannot promise that," she said. "I know it," he said. "I said it anyway. What do you need?" "I need to get to Abilene before the 30 days are up. I need someone to look after the cows and the chickens while I am gone." "Done," he said immediately. She looked at him. "That is a significant—" "It is not," he said. "It is 3 days, perhaps 4. I have the cattle under control and I can manage your animals as well. What else?" "I need someone to come to Abilene with me." She said this carefully, "as a witness. The original survey was done when Thomas was alive, but the surveyor, a man named Cole, is still in Abilene as far as I know, and if he will testify that the original markers were set correctly, that is significant." She paused. "I do not want to go alone." He looked at her for a moment that felt long. "I will come with you." She had not actually expected him to say yes so easily, and the ease of it, the absence of any condition or hesitation, was something she had to look away from briefly before she could look back. "It is a 2-day ride," she said. "I know it. People will talk." "People are already talking," he said. "Ada Prewitt has been conducting what I believe is an extensive informal survey of this county's opinion on the subject of you and me since approximately my 3rd week here." She stared at him. "You knew about that?" "She told me herself. She seems to regard transparency as one of her virtues." "She regards nosiness as one of her virtues," Eliza said, but she was fighting something that wanted to be a smile. "She is not wrong, though. She is never wrong about people." "I know," he said, and then quietly, not looking away from her, "I am not asking you to decide anything right now. I am asking you to let me come to Abilene with you and help you keep your land because it is your land and you have worked for it and you deserve to keep it." She decided something in that moment, though she did not say so, because there were still things that needed to happen in the right order. "All right," she said. "We leave Thursday morning." The ride to Abilene took them through 2 days of Texas summer, dust and heat, and the long flat horizon that seemed to recede as you approached it, the sky above them almost purple in its intensity. They rode side by side, with her things in the saddlebags and the important papers in a leather document case she kept slung across her chest, and they talked more in those 2 days than they had in all the weeks since April. She learned that he could read. He had been educated through 12 years of schooling, which was unusual for a ranch hand, and spoke to his mother's determination before she died. He had read widely in whatever books came to hand on the drives, and he had opinions about things she had not expected him to have opinions about, sharp and considered, and not always conventional. She told him that she had been reading Eliot, George Eliot. She had a copy of Middlemarch that had traveled with her from Tennessee in a trunk that had barely survived the journey west, and she read it in the evenings when the light lasted. A woman writing as a man, he said. She did what she had to do to be taken seriously, Eliza said. I understand the instinct. He looked at her with that attention that she had never quite gotten used to, the quality of it, the completeness. You take yourself seriously, he said. I have had to learn to, she said. Out here, if you do not, no one else will. That is true anywhere, he said, but it is harder to learn in some places than others. They stopped at a way station the first night, a ranch house that took in travelers and provided meals and a place on the barn floor, which was commonplace on the trail. The couple who ran it, an older pair named the Hennessy's, fed them a dinner of salt pork and cornbread and beans, and regarded them with the amiable curiosity of people who saw a great many passing strangers and had developed a rapid system of categorization. Eliza saw Mrs. Hennessy's eyes moved from her to Gilbert and back, and the small approving nod that followed. They reached Abilene on Friday afternoon, and it was everything that Calico Creek was not loud and dense, and smelling powerfully of cattle and sawdust, and a great many people in close proximity. The cattle town was at the height of its season, the stockyards full, the main street thick with drovers and buyers, and the whole mercantile apparatus of the beef trade that was reshaping the Central Plains. Eliza navigated it with the competence of someone who had been to town before and was not easily impressed or unsettled, and Gilbert rode beside her and cleared a path when the crowd required it without making a production of doing so. They found the land office, which was a timber building on the far end of the main street, and presented themselves to the clerk, who was a young man with an air of bureaucratic self-importance that Eliza found irritating and managed with the calm efficiency she had perfected in 2 years of dealing with official processes that were not designed with women in mind. She laid out her documentation. She had everything: the original deed, the survey notes that Thomas had kept, correspondence from the filing office, and the property tax records from the past 4 years, each one a small piece of evidence that this was her land, that she had occupied it and worked it and paid for it continuously and without interruption. The clerk looked it all over with a careful neutrality that she could not read, and said that the hearing would be Monday morning before the land commissioner. She thanked him, and they went to find accommodations, which in Abilene during cattle season required some negotiation. They found 2 rooms at a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Holbrook, who charged fair rates and kept a clean house and did not ask uncomfortable questions, which was all you could reasonably ask. On the Saturday they spent in Abilene, Gilbert tracked down the surveyor Cole, whom Eliza had met once when the original survey was done. Cole was in his 60s now and had been retired from official surveying for 3 years, but he remembered the Hart claim clearly enough, because it had been a straightforward survey with good markers, and he remembered Thomas, and he was willing to appear at the hearing on Monday and say so. That left Sunday, which in Abilene was nominally a day of rest but practically a day of a slightly lower level of commerce. They walked the town in the morning, and she bought a book from a dry goods store that carried a small but respectable selection, and they had a meal at a restaurant that was not the worst she had eaten and considerably better than trail food. And they sat across from each other at a proper table with a checked cloth, and it felt, in the strange way that displacement sometimes allows, more intimate than any of their conversations at fence posts or kitchen tables had felt. "Tell me something about yourself," she said. Something that I would not expect. He thought about it. "I wanted to be a school teacher," he said. "When I was young, I liked books and I liked explaining things. But the war changed everything, and when it was over, the economics of Missouri were not favorable to a young man without land, and the drives were paying $3 a month and found, which was a living. So I went." She absorbed this. It explained the quality of attention he brought to things, the way he engaged with problems as if understanding them fully was the first and necessary step. "And now you have land," she said. "And now I have land," he agreed, "which I hope to keep." She looked at him across the table. "What are you looking for, Mr. Norris, at the end of all of it?" He did not hesitate very long. "A life that means something," he said. "Work that is real. And someone to share it with. The last part I had given up expecting it, if I am honest. The drives are not compatible with a home life, and I was on the drives for 7 years. But now I am not. Now I am." He stopped, and something moved across his face that was the closest thing to vulnerability she had seen from him. "Now I am trying." She looked down at her coffee and back up at him. "Why did you come to Calico Creek?" she asked. "Specifically." "There are land opportunities across half of Texas." "I was told the land was good and the water was reliable," he said. "And I was told there was a woman running the adjacent property on her own who knew every practical thing there was to know about that particular piece of country, and I thought that was a good sign for the quality of the land." She blinked. "Who told you that?" "Ada Pruitt," he said. "I wrote to the general store in Calico Creek before I bought the property, asking about the area. She wrote back, at considerable length." Eliza stared at him for a long moment. Then she put her head in her hands and laughed, genuinely and completely, the full weight of it, and she could feel him watching her and did not care. "Ada Pruitt," she said when she could speak again. "She is a thorough correspondent," he said. "She is an absolute menace," Eliza said, still laughing. "And she was right, wasn't she, about the land?" "She was right about everything," he said. "As far as I can tell." She looked at him. The restaurant was warm around them, and the sounds of Abilene came through the window, and the afternoon light fell at an angle that touched the side of his face, and she thought, "I am in love with this man." It was not a question or a wondering. It was a plain acknowledgement of something she had been working her way toward since April, through all the fence-line conversations and the tin cups of coffee and the badly executed dancing and the shared laughter at fireworks gone sideways. And she looked at it straight on and let it be true. She did not say any of it. Not yet. There was Monday's hearing first, and there were things that had to be settled in the right order. Monday morning came gray and still, the sky above Abilene a flat, pewter color that threatened rain. Eliza dressed carefully in her blue dress, which was her best and which she had brought for exactly this reason, and she braided and pinned her hair and looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin and said quietly and to herself, "This is your land. You know it is your land. Go say so." The land commissioner was a man named Hadley who was somewhere in his 50s, competent and unsmiling, with a reputation for not being bought and also for not being easily impressed. The Braddock Company's representative was a lawyer from San Angelo named Cutter, well-dressed and confident, who looked at Eliza when she walked in with the slight recalibration that men who expect to deal with a timid widow make when they encounter something other than a timid widow. Gilbert sat in the gallery. He had offered to sit at the table with her, but she had said no. This was her claim and she would present it herself, and he had nodded and taken his place in the gallery without argument, and she was grateful for both the offer and the acceptance of her refusal. She presented her case with the methodical clarity of her father's daughter. The deed, the survey notes, the tax records, the continuous occupation. She presented the original survey marker's coordinates from Thomas's notes, and showed that they were consistent with the current ground markers and inconsistent with the Braddock Company's assertion. She called Cole, who testified in his laconic, professional way that the original survey had been conducted correctly, and that the creek bed fell within the Hart claim boundaries as he had staked them. The Braddock lawyer was good. He was practiced and quick, and he raised legitimate-sounding objections and pointed to technical inconsistencies in the 1868 filing language that were real if not especially significant. He was accustomed to winning these hearings, she could tell, because the companies he represented had resources that most individual claimants did not. But she was prepared for what he raised, because she had spent 2 evenings in Abilene reading the relevant statutes in a law book she had borrowed from Mrs. Holbrook, who apparently kept a small library of practical legal texts for exactly this sort of purpose. And she addressed each point in turn with the measured, factual precision of someone who has had to learn to be her own advocate, because the alternative was not having one. When it was done, Hadley deliberated for 23 minutes, and then he ruled in her favor. The creek was hers. The boundary was as filed. The Braddock petition was dismissed. She stood up from the table with the steadiness of someone who has been holding themselves very carefully and allows themselves to unclench only slowly, degree by degree. She shook Hadley's hand when he offered it and thanked Cole and gathered her papers and walked out of the land office into the pewter morning, which had begun to rain, a soft summer rain that felt appropriate and almost deliberate. Gilbert was behind her. He had come through the gallery door and he was there, and she turned around and looked at him and he looked back at her, and she crossed the distance between them and walked straight into him, and he put his arms around her without hesitation or ceremony, and she let him, and they stood in the rain outside the land office in Abilene, and neither of them said anything at all for a long moment. "You were extraordinary in there," he said quietly. "I was prepared," she said into the wool of his coat. "There is a difference. You were both," he said. She stepped back, though she did not go far, and looked up at him in the rain and said what she had been deciding to say since Sunday afternoon at the restaurant. "Gilbert." He looked at her carefully, the way he always looked at things. "I am not easy to be with," she said. "I have spent 2 years being entirely self-reliant, and I have gotten very good at it, and there are parts of that that are not going to go away. I am not going to need someone to fix things for me or tell me what to do or make my decisions, and I am not going to be managed." "I know," he said. I find that I want you to be there," she said. "That is a new experience for me with anyone other than Thomas, and I am telling you because I think honesty is worth more than strategy." "It is," he said. "I am telling you that I want you to be there," she said, "and I am asking whether you want to be there." He looked at her for a moment with the full weight of his attention, and then he raised a hand and touched her face with a gentleness that was entirely inconsistent with the size of his hands and the roughness of his work and the practical directness of everything else about him, and he said, "Eliza." "Yes." She closed her eyes briefly and then opened them, and she was smiling, and he was looking at her the way she had seen him look at the windmill when it finally turned, with the pleasure of something achieved that was worth achieving. The rain continued, and they were getting wet, and she laughed at that and he laughed with her, and they went back to Mrs. Holbrook's to collect their things and prepare for the ride home. The ride back to Calico Creek was different from the ride out. The conversation was different, deeper and easier in the way conversations become when something has been established and does not need to be navigated around anymore. They talked about the future with a directness that neither of them would have managed a month ago. He talked about his plans for the cattle operation, expanding to 30 head by the following spring. She talked about the garden, about the possibility of growing wheat if she could get the eastern field cultivated. "That eastern field," he said thoughtfully, "it runs right along the boundary between our properties." "It does. If it were cultivated together, the yield would be considerably higher." She glanced at him. "Are you proposing a farming partnership, Mr. Norris?" "I am proposing whatever you are comfortable proposing," he said. "I am flexible on the structure." She looked at the road ahead. "I will think about it," she said, "all of it. Take all the time you need," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." They arrived back in Calico Creek on Wednesday evening, and the first person they saw on the main street was Ada Prewitt, who was sweeping her porch and who looked at them riding in together with an expression of serene satisfaction that communicated, without a single word being spoken, that she had been expecting this. "Well," Ada called. "The claim is upheld," Eliza said. Ada clasped her hands together. "Good, and the rest of it?" "Ada," Eliza said. "I am asking after the whole situation," Ada said innocently. "I can see that," Eliza said, and rode on, and she could hear Ada laughing behind her. Life in Calico Creek settled back into its rhythms, but the rhythms were different now, because there was a thing between Eliza Hart and Gilbert Norris that had been named, and named things have a different quality in the landscape than unnamed ones. He came to dinner on Friday evenings. She rode over on Sunday mornings, and they drank coffee on the porch he had finished rebuilding, which was level and solid, and had a view of the eastern pasture that was genuinely lovely in the morning light. They worked the boundary fence together on Saturday afternoons, and discussed the creek levels and the grass, and the cattle and the garden and books, and the war in Missouri and Tennessee, and the particular quality of West Texas light in the autumn, which was coming on now, the brutal heat finally moderating into something golden and forgiving. He kissed her for the first time on a Saturday afternoon in late September, without particular drama or pre-announcement, on the porch of her house with the sound of the creek in the background and the last light of the day on the dry grass, and it was both a surprise and exactly what she had known was coming, and it was very good. She told him so, which made him laugh. "You are very direct," he said. "I told you I was," she said. "Did you want me to be coy?" "No," he said immediately and with great sincerity. "No, I did not." October brought a letter from Kansas City. It was from Clara Cooley, the woman whose papers Gilbert had found in the wall of the house he had bought, and it was the most grateful letter Eliza had read in recent memory. Clara Cooley had not known the papers were there. She had packed in a great hurry, in the panic of a family leaving a failing homestead with almost nothing, and she had thought those photographs, and that letter and that tiny shoe were lost forever. The shoe had belonged to her daughter, she wrote, her youngest, who had died of fever in the winter of 1869, and having it back was more than she could express. Eliza read the letter to Gilbert on the following Sunday morning on the porch, and when she got to the part about the shoe and the daughter, her voice stopped working briefly, and she felt his hand cover hers on the porch railing. "We did a good thing," he said quietly. "You did a good thing," she said when she could speak again. "You found the box, and you did not throw it away." "We did a good thing together," he said, which was, she was learning, very like him, the insistence on the shared nature of things, the refusal to take credit that was not entirely his. November, and the first engagement of the season between the territorial law and the rougher elements of the cattle trade, which was as regular as the seasons themselves. 3 men connected to the Braddock Company, apparently still aggrieved about the hearing in August, rode past her fence line one night and cut the wire in 4 places, which was the kind of message that large operations had been sending to small landowners for a generation. She discovered it in the morning and fixed it herself, because she was not going to wait for anyone to fix it for her, and then she rode to town and made a formal report to the sheriff, a man named Greer who was honest and unhurried, and had excellent recall for the details of the Braddock Company's previous activities in the county. The sheriff rode out to inspect the damage, and then sent a letter to the Braddock Company's principal offices in San Angelo that communicated, in the measured language of official correspondence, that any further interference with the Hart property would be treated as criminal mischief under the relevant statutes. There was no further interference. The Braddock Company, whatever else it was run by people who understood when a situation had stopped being profitable and started being expensive. Gilbert had not intervened in any of this except to help her string the new wire, which was heavy work and genuinely easier with two people. She had not asked him to intervene, and he had known not to offer more than was asked. This was, she reflected as they worked the fence in the November wind, one of the more remarkable things about him, the understanding of what was hers to handle and what was genuinely partnership. "There is something I want to ask you," he said, at the end of a stretch of fence, as they were tying off the wire. She looked at him. The wind was cold and the light was thin, and he was looking at her with an expression that was serious and contained and not at all uncertain, which was different from the way he had looked when he had shown her the tin box, when he was uncertain, and she understood the difference and felt something in her chest settle deep and sure. "Then ask," she said. He did. He was not elaborate about it, and he was not performative, because those were not his qualities. But he was thorough and honest in the way he always was, and he said that he knew it was soon by some measures, and by other measures it was not soon at all, because they had been neighbors and then friends, and then something more, and that he understood if she needed time, but that he wanted to share his life with her if she would allow it, and that he believed they were good together in all the ways that mattered. She looked at him in the cold November wind, with the fence wire between them and her whole life spread out on both sides of it, the 80 acres she had held and kept and fought for, and the property to the north that he had made into something from nothing, and the shared boundary that had turned from a line of potential dispute into the ordinary geography of a shared existence. "Yes," she said, "I will allow it." He came around the fence post and took her face in his rough, cold hands and kissed her in the November wind, and she put her hands over his, and the cattle watched from a respectful distance, and the day was beautiful. They were married on the 15th of December, 1872, in the church at Calico Creek, which was decorated for Christmas and therefore more festive than strictly necessary. But the timing could not be helped, and it suited her, in fact, because she had always loved Christmas in a way she had not quite admitted to herself, and she thought Thomas would have found it appropriate and probably a little funny, the two things not being mutually exclusive. Ada Pruitt cried. She was not apologetic about it. Sheriff Greer and his wife attended. Overton the blacksmith attended. Cole, the retired surveyor who had testified for her in Abilene, attended, because she had written and invited him, and he had ridden from Abilene for the occasion, which touched her more than she had expected. She wore the blue dress. She had considered whether to have something new made, and then she had considered what money was available and what the dress meant to her. It was the best thing she had, and she had worn it to the 4th of July dance and to the land hearing in Abilene, and both of those had gone well. And she decided that some things carry their history with them, and that is a good thing, not a sad one. He was waiting at the altar with his hat in his hands and his hair combed, and a look on his face that was not nervous exactly, but was the look of someone to whom this moment meant everything. And when she came down the aisle, she looked at him and thought, "This is the right thing. Not the comfortable thing, not the expected thing, but the right thing, which is different and better." The pastor said the words and they said theirs, and when it was done and they walked out into the cold December air into a shower of grain thrown by Ada and Mrs. Greer and anyone else within throwing distance, Eliza laughed and Gilbert laughed, and it was, all of it, very good. The winter of 1872 into 1873 was a hard one, which was not unusual for the Central Plains, but they were together in it. And being together in a hard winter is different from being alone in one. The stock needed more attention, and the fuel needed more management, and the cold got into places it had no business being, including under the door of what was now their house. They had agreed to live in Eliza's house because it was in better repair, and Gilbert had been working steadily to improve it. But the house was warm at its center in a way it had not been for 2 years. And Eliza was aware of this every morning when she came downstairs, and he was already at the stove with coffee made. She had not known she was lonely. She had known she was alone, but she had not known that alone and lonely were different things until they stopped being the same thing, and the difference was not what she had expected. She had expected relief. What she got was something quieter, a kind of deepening, as if the world had gained another dimension it had previously been lacking. In February, she told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning at the table with the blunt directness that was her way with important things, and she watched his face change in a way she had not seen it change before, not the careful, controlled expression he usually maintained, but something open and unguarded, something that looked very much like joy in its pure form. "Are you well?" he asked first. "I am well," she said. "Are you?" He stopped. "How do you feel about it?" She considered this honestly. "I feel frightened," she said. "And I feel glad." In that order, and sometimes both at once, she looked at him. "How do you feel?" "Exactly the same," he said. "Both at once and sometimes frightened first." He reached across the table and covered her hands with his, and that was enough. The spring of 1873 arrived in its usual rushed, generous way, and with it, the considerable physical labor of keeping the Hart and Norris properties running simultaneously, which they were doing now as a single operation, though with the careful maintenance of Eliza's land in her name, because she had not fought a Braddock Company petition to lose track of her own deed. They planted the eastern field together, the one that ran along the property boundary, and it turned out to be a reasonable wheat plot, nothing spectacular but productive enough to justify the effort, and she thought of what he had said on the road back from Abilene and felt the rightness of things that come together slowly. The cattle operation was growing. He had brought his 12 head up from 23 over the winter, with careful purchasing and one very good deal from a drover passing through who needed to reduce his herd quickly and took a fair price for 3 good breeding cows. The pastures could sustain 40 head comfortably, he calculated, and they were on their way. She was still running her garden, still selling eggs and preserves to Ada, still doing the accounts, because she was better at figures than he was, which he had admitted freely and without apparent embarrassment, and which she had accepted without comment, it being simply a fact of how things were. On the 3rd of September, 1873, their son was born. The delivery was attended by a woman named Mrs. Yancey, who was the closest thing Calico Creek had to a midwife, and who had delivered a considerable portion of the current population of the county. Gilbert waited in the front room with the particular suffering of a man who is not accustomed to being unable to do anything useful, and when Mrs. Yancey opened the bedroom door and told him to come in, he crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Eliza, who was exhausted and intact and holding a small, dark-haired, furiously alive person, and his expression was one she would keep for the rest of her life. "He is healthy," Mrs. Yancey said. "Both of them are healthy." "What will you call him?" Mrs. Yancey asked. Eliza looked at Gilbert. They had talked about names. "James," Gilbert said. "James Thomas Norris." Thomas was Eliza's choice, and Gilbert had suggested putting it second rather than first so the boy would not feel the weight of it, and she had agreed. And James Thomas Norris came into the world in September 1873, hollering with impressive volume, and did not stop for some time, which Mrs. Yancey said was an excellent sign. Ada came the following morning with a basket that contained enough food to sustain a small army, which was Ada's way of expressing the things she was too dignified to express directly, and she held James with the expertise of a woman who had held many babies and looked down at him with an expression that was not maternal. She had never had children of her own, but was something equally warm, the love of a community for its newest member. "He looks like both of you," Ada said. "That is kind of you to say," Eliza said. "It is accurate," Ada said. "He has your stubbornness around the jaw in his. I do not yet know what his quality is in the child's face. We will have to see what he grows into." She handed James back. "I want you to know," she said with a directness unusual even for her, "that I am very pleased about all of this, about you and him and this child. I had hoped for it." "I know you had," Eliza said. "You are incapable of subtlety, Ada." "I am capable of subtlety," Ada said. "I simply do not see the point of it when directness will do." Life with a child in the house was exhausting and loud and occasionally alarming, and also something Eliza had not anticipated, which was deeply, specifically funny in a way that the preceding 2 years had not been. James had opinions from the beginning, strong and frequent ones, which he communicated with all the effectiveness available to a person whose vocabulary consisted entirely of volume. Gilbert navigated fatherhood with the same focused, practical approach he brought to everything, learning the specific communications of his son with the same attention he had brought to learning the land, and he was, Eliza observed in the small hours of the night when she was feeding James, and Gilbert was sitting up with her though she had not asked him to, genuinely good at it. "You do not have to be awake," she said in the dark. "I know," he said. "Then go back to sleep." "I would rather be here," he said simply. She looked at him in the low light and thought about the morning in April when she had stood at her kitchen window and watched a rider go past on the road north, and what she had felt then, that unnamed weariness, that sleeplessness, and what she felt now, which was not the absence of weariness so much as the presence of something so much larger than it that weariness had become irrelevant. "I know I said you could take all the time you needed," he said. "You did," she agreed, settling James against her shoulder. "I want you to know that I have been," he paused, choosing his words with the deliberation she associated with him. "I have been grateful every day of this year, for the land, yes, but for the rest of it, for you particularly." "Particularly," she repeated, amused. "Preeminently," he said, "if you prefer." She looked at him across the dim room, this man who had come to Calico Creek with a worn saddle and a bay horse and the willingness to build something from very little, who had stood at her gate with a tin box and a question, and had turned every encounter with her into something more than either of them had gone looking for. "I was not going to love anyone again," she said. "I want you to know that. I had decided, after Thomas, I had decided it was too expensive. And now," he said. "And now," she said, "I find that you were considerably better value than I anticipated." He laughed quietly, so as not to disturb James, who had finally settled, and reached across and tucked a piece of her hair back from her face with one careful finger. And the tenderness of it, the ease of it, the ordinary miracle of a person who knew you and touched you as if you were something worth touching carefully. She felt it all the way down. "Same to you," he said. The years that followed were not without difficulty, because no years are, and the West Texas of the 1870s was not a landscape that offered difficulty in small amounts. There were droughts and there were floods, and there were cattle prices that swung with the kind of violence that made planning feel like a ridiculous exercise. And there were the ongoing adjustments of two people who were both accustomed to their own ways, attempting to navigate a shared life disagreements. Some of them serious, about money, and about the cattle operation, and about the best way to manage a wet season, and about the appropriate response when James, at age 2, figured out how to open the gate on the chicken coop, which resulted in a scene of comprehensive chaos that was objectively funny only in retrospect. But they were good at the disagreements, or they got good at them. They were people who talked, both of them, though in different registers. She was direct and quick, he was measured and thorough, and they had learned early that the combination, while sometimes frustrating, was more effective than either alone. In the spring of 1876, their daughter arrived. They named her Martha, for his mother, whom he had described to Eliza so many times that she felt she knew her. And she came into the world with considerably less drama than James had, and immediately established herself as the more observant of the two children, watching everything around her with large dark eyes that missed nothing, which Eliza considered a quality to be encouraged. James, who was 2.5 at this point and deeply invested in his own sovereignty, adjusted to his sister after a period of pointed protest that lasted approximately 3 weeks and then resolved itself. And by the summer he had appointed himself her primary protector, which manifested mainly in his standing near her basket and glaring at the dog, a cattle dog named Scout, whom he theoretically loved and practically did not trust near the baby. The cattle operation reached 42 head in 1877, which was the number Gilbert had calculated would make the property sustainably profitable. And it was a good year for beef, and a good year for wheat, and the vegetable garden produced an abundance of tomatoes that summer that kept Eliza canning until her hands were red from the heat. And she sold the surplus to Ada, and to the hotel that had opened in Calico Creek in 1875. Which was the clearest sign that the town was growing into something more permanent than the temporary settlements that had characterized the early cattle boom. Ada Pruitt, in the summer of 1877, got married herself, which surprised everyone in Calico Creek except possibly Eliza, who had watched the growing frequency of Mr. Beaumont, the fiddle player's visits to the general store, and had drawn the obvious conclusion. Ada, who had spent decades dispensing other people's romantic affairs with the enthusiasm of a woman with opinions on the subject, turned out to be entirely incapable of the same directness when it was her own affair, and had needed, as far as Eliza could determine, approximately 4 years of Mr. Beaumont's patient attendance before she conceded the point. Eliza was at the wedding with Gilbert and the children and felt the particular satisfaction of watching someone she loved get what they deserved. "She looks happy," Gilbert said quietly. "She is appalled," Eliza said, equally quietly, "and happy. They are not mutually exclusive, as I recall." He took her hand, which he did easily now, the way you do with a person whose hand you have taken many times before, and she held his and watched Ada Pruitt, who had started all of this with a letter to a stranger asking after land quality and reporting on the neighbor's situation with characteristic thoroughness, stand up in the front of the church in Calico Creek and commit herself to a life that was smaller and better than the one she had planned. The homesteads, both of them now, the Hart property and the former Cooley place, were well established by 1878. The houses had been improved considerably. The barn on the north property had been rebuilt properly, finally, and the windmill that Eliza had helped align in that early spring of 1872 was still turning, still reliable, which she found disproportionately satisfying. The eastern wheat field had been cultivated and expanded, and it was the shared project that she thought about most when she thought about what they had built together. Not the cattle or the garden or the house improvements, but that field that ran along the old boundary line, which now marked the center of something rather than the edge. James, who was 5 and opinionated and already clearly going to be tall like his father, had developed a passionate interest in the cattle that Gilbert was carefully and patiently cultivating, because a child who loves the work is worth 10 farmhands who do not, and James could already name every animal in the herd individually and had opinions about their personalities. Martha, who was 2, had opinions about everything and the vocabulary to express most of them, which the whole family found both exhausting and impressive. On the last evening of autumn in 1878, they sat on the front porch of the Hart house together after the children were in bed, with the remnants of the day's warmth still in the boards under their feet, and the first real cold of winter moving in from the north, and the stars out in their extravagant abundance. She had a cup of coffee, and he had one too, and they sat in the porch chairs that he had made that summer from good white oak, and they were quiet together in the way that people are quiet together, when the quiet is something they have built and tend to, not an absence but a presence. She thought about that morning in April of 1872, 6.5 years ago, when she had stood at her kitchen window and watched a rider go past on the road north and felt that unnamed, wary thing. She thought about the sleeplessness that had followed night after night, and how she had not known what she was lying awake for, only that something had changed and she did not yet know the shape of it. She knew the shape of it now. It had a name, and a bay horse he still called Copper who was starting to show his age gracefully, and 2 children asleep in the house behind them, and a history of cleared boundary lines and shared fences and tin cups of coffee and terrible dancing, and a hearing room in Abilene, and a winter field of wheat and years of this specific texture of being known and being kept and keeping in return. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking," she said, "that I did not sleep well after you moved in next door." He looked at her. "I remember you told me you were not immediately welcoming." "I was not," she said. "I lay awake wondering what I was dealing with. And now you know." "And now I know," she agreed. He set his cup down and reached over and took her hand, and they sat on the porch in the turning autumn dark, and the windmill on the north property turned in the cold air, steady as it had always been since she helped him set it right, and the cattle moved somewhere in the dark pasture with their particular low sound, and the house was warm behind them, and the children were safe inside it, and the land stretched out in both directions, hers and his and theirs, every acre of it earned and kept and true. "It turned out well," she said. "It did," he said. He raised her hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, not ceremonially but simply, the way you mark something you are grateful for. "It turned out well." The night settled around Calico Creek, around the two properties with their shared fence line and their eastern wheat field and their windmill turning in the cold. And inside the house James slept with his arm around the old dog Scout, who had long since been forgiven for the baby-adjacent crimes of his youth. And Martha slept with her dark, observant eyes closed and her small fists curled beside her face, dreaming whatever it is that 2-year-olds dream. And on the porch, the two people who had built all of this sat in the chairs made of good white oak and held hands in the dark and let the night pass over them, and it was enough. It was, by any honest accounting, more than enough. It was the whole and real and complete life that Eliza Hart had not known. She was waiting for when a rider came past on the road north on a morning in April 1872, going toward the abandoned homestead next door, and changed the shape of everything.